Damon Fordham, professor of history at Springfield College in Charleston, South Carolina, and author of 3 books, True Stories of Black South Carolina, Voices of Black South Carolina, and the novel of Mr. Potts and Me, all of which can be found on Amazon.com. Now, one of the things that I try to do in teaching history is to make it practical so that it's useful to people in modern times. And one of the really interesting stories about that deals with Booker T. Washington, who I will discuss in a moment. But first, let me ask you folks this. Today, you have a large number of young people who may have grown up with parents or fathers or mothers or just adults in general that they find no pride in them. They grow up with people who just aren't able to serve as positive role models for them. And so, of course, the question is, what can they possibly do about that? Well, one of the great stories in history involves Booker T. Washington, who you see on the cover of this book, Up from Slavery, one of the great classics of literature. Now, what does that have to do with young children today? I want you to think about this. Now, Booker T. Washington was born in slavery in West Virginia. And he was actually old enough to remember when they read the Emancipation Proclamation written by President Abraham Lincoln that set himself and his family as well as the rest of his people free. So for years he worked in a coal mine before he was able to get an education. And he never knew the identity of his father. And his mother, died relatively young. But he had something to say about that. He said, consider this. He said, more than once I have tried to picture myself in the position of a boy and man with an honored and distinguished ancestry which I could trace back through a period of hundreds of years and who had not only inherited a name but fortune and a proud family homestead. And yet I have sometimes had the feeling that if I had inherited those, if I had been a member of a more popular race, I should have been inclined to yield to the temptation of depending on my ancestry and my color to do that for me which I should do for myself. In other words, many of us know these people who I guess you could call ancestor chasers. They always brag about, well, my ancestor did this and my ancestor did that and so forth, but what did you do as an individual? And many of those individuals don't have a whole lot to say about that. On the other hand, you do have these people who use that as a means of inspiring themselves, but what if you don't have that? Well, Booker T. Washington said this. Years ago, I resolved that because I had no ancestry myself, I would leave a record of which my children would be proud, and which might encourage them to still higher effort. In other words, what Booker T. Washington is saying is this. Being that he had nobody he could look back on and say that I had this person or I had that person as a role model, he was determined to make himself that kind of person. So at a time when he had absolutely no money, he literally walked 400 miles from Malden, West Virginia to Hampton, Virginia, where the Hampton Institute, which is now known as Hampton University, is today. And he came there dirty, ragged, and stink and offered himself to sweep the floors, clean the barns, or do whatever was necessary to work his way through to get an education. Did it pay off? Well, how's about this? A man who went on to help find the Tuskegee University, which is still thriving nearly 100 years after his death, went on to be the first African American to have lunch with the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, and he managed to inspire many young people to go on to do better for themselves, such as one gentleman named William J. Edwards, who went on to form the Snow Hill Academy in Alabama after he learned from Booker T. Washington. William J. Edwards was also the great-grandfather of the filmmaker Shelton Jackson Lee, who most of you know as Spike. He also went on to inspire a young man in Jamaica and corresponded with him and invited him to America where he would teach him the benefits of leadership. Well, by the time the young man got here, Booker T. had died, but he always said that reading Booker T. Washington's story in Up from Slavery inspired him to do what he do. That was Marcus Garvey, one of the first individuals who tried to make a link between black Americans, black Jamaicans, and Africans. So, but the point of all of this is that even if you may not have a parent or grandparents or any older people around who you could say would be a great role model to you, you could basically try to make a role model of yourself so that others could look on and be proud of you. This is Damon Fordham talking about Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery.